evening, everyone. How is everybody? Good. It's been a long first day, but a great one, I hope. I'm going to introduce our speaker in a moment, but just to give you a sense of how this evening will go, you can see on either kind of midpoint, there's two microphones in stands. So once the talk is done, and we certainly encourage your questions, you can line up on whichever microphone is more efficient for you, and you can we'll rotate either side. So I'd like to formally welcome you to the Lev Dobriansky Lecture on Political Economy. This lecture was established in 1996 to honor a distinguished individual who was also a dear friend to the Fund for American Studies. Ambassador Dobriansky passed away on January 31, 2008, but we keep his spirit alive through this lecture. He played a key role in establishing our academic programs in 1970 when he was a professor at Georgetown. He served as the academic director for our programs from 1970 to 1982, so he had a long history with TFAS. He served on the faculty of Georgetown University as well from 1948 until he was nominated by President Reagan to serve as U.S. ambassador to the Bahamas in 1982. He was a faculty member of the National War College from 1957 to 58 and served during his career as a consultant with the U.S. Department of State, the International Communication Agency, and the U.S. House of Representatives. Ambassador Dobriansky was also the force behind the Victims of Communism Memorial that was erected on New Jersey Avenue near the Capitol in 2007, a monument that every TFAS student should visit this summer if you are able to. Among the distinguished speakers who have delivered the Dobriansky Lecture have been Nobel laureates, including economist James Buchanan, prominent academics such as Bill Easterly of New York University and Michael Munger of Duke, Federal Reserve Bank presidents, past members of the president's cabinet, and a number of other renowned economists and political scientists. Continuing this impressive tradition, tonight we have the honor of hearing from Veronique de Rugy. She is the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a nationally syndicated columnist. Her primary research interests include the U.S. economy, the federal budget, taxation, tax competition, cronyism, and family policy. Her popular weekly columns address economic issues ranging from lessons on creating sustainable economic growth to the implications of government tax and fiscal policies. She has testified numerous times in front of Congress, including last week, I think, on the effects of fiscal stimulus, debt and deficits, and regulation of the economy. Veronique is the author of a weekly column for the Creators Syndicate, writes regular columns for Reason Magazine, and she blogs about economics at National Review Online's The Corner. Her charts, articles, and commentary have been featured pretty much everywhere in a wide range of media outlets. I'll name a few, including the Reality Check segment on Bloomberg Television's Street Smart, the New York Times Room for Debate, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Stossel, 2020, and C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and Fox News. In 2015, she was named in Politico Magazine's Guide to the Top 50 Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming American Politics. Previously, she has been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, and a research fellow at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Before moving to the United States, she oversaw academic programs in France for the Institute for Humane Studies. She received her MA in economics from Paris Dauphine University and her PhD in economics from the Pantheon-Sorbonne University. I have to say, on a personal note, that I met Vero in 2000 as I walked into the halls of GMU as a grad student for the first time, and we have been friends ever since. So it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Veronique de Rugy.
Thank you, Anne. And don't be impressed with the resume. When you're my age, you too will have a lot of lines on your introduction and your bio and things like this. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. And yes, Anne and I go way, way back. I remember when we were geeking out about Cobb Douglas and elasticity being one and all that stuff. And we became fast friends, like immediately. And so it's just always a pleasure to see you and to see how successful you've been. So let's start this. So today, I want to talk to you about some worrisome trend in politics and policy that have developed in the last few years. The rise of national conservative movement, or those I will call the NatCons, has created a new platform for the Republican Party based on economic protectionism and a desire for traditional family values. I have nothing against traditional family values. I have a lot against protectionism, but nothing against traditional family values. But in some cases, these guys have launched an outright war on the liberal order. And this is why I think it's important to talk about it tonight. So there are two distinct and yet related issues that have been at the core of this fight. So the first one is the fact that a large number of men have dropped out of the labor force in the last decades, right? The second is a sense that the American family is in crisis. Unfortunately, the national conservative movement is no doubt well-intentioned in its desire to lift up men and strengthen families, but its approach is really misguided. And there's one thing that I really worry about, and that is that this approach risks having some very unwelcome outcomes for women. So as a libertarian, I'll put my cards out there. I believe in the fundamental rights of every individual, regardless of sex or race, to chart his or her own path. I oppose coercive policies that limits people's freedoms and impose a particular vision of the good life on everyone. One beauty of the free society is that it actually allows for a diversity of family and work arrangement based on diverse individual preferences and circumstances. And I believe that what I'm going to be talking to you about actually threatens, the diversity of these arrangements. So some of the populist concerns or NatCon concerns, they're real. They're absolutely real. So the first one is that men have dropped out of the labor force. Just to give you an idea, in 1950, 86% of men had a job or were looking for one. That number now has fallen to 67.7%. Right now, I want to make one thing clear. Not everything in the decline of the labor force participation for men is a bad thing. For instance, you men that I see here, right? You're part of the decline number. It's because you've decided to extend your time at a time where past generation of men would actually be in the labor force. You've decided to extend your time in education. There's also the trend of people retiring early or dropping out to take care of their grandchildren and things like that. These are all good things. But there is a lot of men. So the numbers I've seen vary from almost 6 million to 7 or 8 million. So it's a pretty big number of men who've dropped out of the labor force. Who are these men? I mean, you can think about the cliche of, the guy who's failed to launch and is still in his parents' basement. But there's also a lot of drug abuse, death of despair, all of this, or like on their way to death of despair. So I mean, it's a real big deal. The second concern, right, is about the family. You probably hear a lot about it there's a lot of talks about the decline in fertility, but first and foremost, what NatCons and others worry about is the decline in marriage. In 1960, 82% of Americans between 24 and 34 were married. So I don't know how old you are, but if you're not married and if you're over 24, you're in the new number that I will cite today. Today, that number is 30.2%, right? So there's a significant decline. Now, part of it is that people are deferring marriage. When you look at the overall population, not just this small, the trend looks slightly different, right? There's this enormous peak after the war. 1946 is the top of the marriage rate. People were really happy to see each other, and after a long war, and then it declines. But since then, it's actually declined by, sorry, I'm looking at my daughter. I shouldn't do that. It's declined roughly by half. So, I mean, it's a significant decline, right? So academics, they're concerned with both the fall and men labor force participation and the marriage rate. And I'm concerned too. I mean, it's not wrong that the NatCons are voicing their concern. That's not the problem. What is wrong and is a little frightening is what NatCon use as a scapegoat for these very real problems. And that is women in the workforce. See, we have a lot of evidence that higher labor force participation is actually a really good thing. It's really good for growth. That's great. And we also have a lot of evidence that actually women entering into the labor force, actually it started, steadily in the 1940s, if you exclude a lot of the stuff before, which we'll talk about. That has basically been the driver of economic growth in the second half of the 20th century. It's a big thing, but NatCons, they don't see it this way. First, they blame the decline in men's labor force participation on the loss of manufacturing jobs like welding and machinery. Then they blame the decline in marriage on both the decline in manufacturing jobs and on the very progressive senators from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, called the two-income trap. What's that? So let me tell you what it is. According to this theory, in the past, two parents could raise their children on one income. And according to the theory, now it's not possible. Why is it not possible? Well, the idea is like as men were dropping out of the labor force, women were entering, right? And as men were declining, they were making themselves less appealing to women and so on and so forth. That's part of the story. But the second part of the story is that these women entering the labor force, right, were making all this money and bidding up middle class goods, making prices going up, and hence becoming the slave of this need to work because everything was more expensive and you could not anymore afford these standards of living without two income. So that's the two-income trap. Now, I will say this up front, the idea that female workers are to blame for the higher cost of middle-class amenities is both insulting and wrong, but we'll see that later. That said, though Elizabeth Warren is a very progressive senator, the two-income trap has become the foundation of many arguments made by the NatCon, like Tucker Carlson, who's the former host of Fox News. And one night when he was on Fox, he did a big statement where he said he urged his viewer to stop applauding women in the labor force because, as he told them, it had been a disaster for families. So now I want to talk to you about the public policy they have in mind to fix this problem. So they fall in two big categories. The first category is basically it's a bunch of spending programs that are meant to alleviate or to help women balance their stressful work-life balance, right? So that includes policies like a federal paid leave, policies subsidizing childcare. It also includes the dream of an enormous child tax credit that would, I think, better be described as UBI for children. Just to give you an idea, this is pushed by both the Republicans and the Democrats. That proposal that they would love to pass is a proposal that would give, I think it's $3,600 per children under 6, and then $2,000, I think, for children between 6 and 18. So you do the calculation if you're a parent and you have like 3 kids with a mix of, and for parents who do not have a taxable income, this would come in the form of hard cash every month. You can, if you understand economics, you can see how for some family this would cause disincentive to work. But again, maybe the NatCons wouldn't, care so much about that. So Democrats, they agree with these policy broadly, right? I mean, they want a big child tax credit. In fact, originally they're the ones who were pushing for it. They like a federal paid leave. They'd like to subsidize childcare, but they disagree on the design. So, for instance, a populist conservative Senator Rubio from Florida, what he wants to do, he agrees with the Democrats that we actually need a federal paid leave program. But what he would like to do is he would like parents to get 12 weeks of vacation, of paid leave. It's not vacation when you have a newborn, but not you, of course, you were vacation. But so 12 weeks of paid leave paid through Social Security. Now, the conservative likes this program. Why? Because they think it's budget neutral, because in theory, the family, the mom, would then repay the program effectively by retiring decades later, a few weeks or months later, depending on how much she had gotten, right? Now, I have a lot of issues with this program, not the least that I think it's not the role of the federal government to do that, or the state government, but more importantly, I mean, Social Security is literally insolvent, right? And politicians have made a ton of promises and they have no way to pay for it, right? If they want to maintain the benefits, they're going to have to borrow over $40 trillion in the next 30 years. That's more than the federal government has actually borrowed in the entire history of the US. If you add Medicare, by the way, just if you want to keep a number, it's like $116 trillion over 30 years. Our national debt is $34 trillion right now, so let you do the math. I don't know who's going to lend us that money. And if they decide to do nothing, like President Trump and President Biden keep promising, what's going to happen is like actually benefits in 34 are going to be cut by 20%. You know, I'm okay with that. I mean, I actually would prefer if we did a more ordered form of reduction of benefits, so at least the people who really truly need it, have it. But this is the reality of Social Security. So the idea that actually we should be using Social Security that is already not functioning as a system of payment for retirees and disabled people, that is actually going to on top be used to pay paid leave seems a little demented to me. In addition, of course, this opens a door for other people saying, well, you know what? If we use it for paid leave, we can use it for other things. My dear friend Elizabeth, Senator Warren, has already said, like, why not use it for people to buy their first house? Or so you see how that goes, right? But it's a bad idea for many more reasons. For one thing, this idea that and that actually I want to say this too, because a lot of proposals that make promises about repayment in the future, I call it the dessert now, spinach later. It doesn't work with kids. It doesn't work with Congress. We have no way to tie the hands of future Congresses. There's just no way, right? So this notion that we're going to be able to let parents use benefits of this insolvent program, and then that somehow we can get politicians of the future to sustain the whining of those people saying it's unfair that now I have to retire later, right? That these guys are going to have some backbone just seems kind of, I'm skeptical, let's put it this way, right? But there are other problems. There are really other problems with the NatCons, and I will say Democrats push for paid leave. The first one is this idea that because the federal government doesn't provide paid leave, it means that parents in America don't have paid leave. That's nonsense. That's a trope that is used constantly. It's like, well, the federal government doesn't do it, and other countries do it, and hence it means that it doesn't exist in the US. It's not true, actually. They repeat the left and the right who are supporter of a federal paid leave program, they repeat all the time a BLS number, Bureau of Labor Statistics, that is absolutely real, which is 21% of women have paid leave. But that number, while real, what it measures is the number of women who benefit from a program called paid leave. But it doesn't at all take into consideration the millions of women who actually take paid leave when they have children, except they take it through other programs like temporary disability insurance. That's what I did. I assume it's probably what you did. I mean, or like many other different form of arrangement. In fact, government data that actually looked at the number of women who say they have access to a paid leave program is more like 66% of workers, actually. So it's not just women. So it's significantly more. So you'd say, well, shouldn't everyone have paid leave? An ideal world where there's no cost, where it's all, money falls from the sky. And by the way, I want to say that I'm very supportive of paid leave program. I think it has many wonderful benefits, but the answer to that question is always, sure, what trade-offs are you willing to shoulder? So to give you an example, right? One of the things that people don't understand is when a company starts providing fringe benefits, right? Which is actually a lot of companies, especially big companies, right? What they do is like they just don't give it to you in addition to your pay. Yes, they do this for the employees who are already there when the program is implemented. But what happens is like companies measure the value of their employees based on the total compensation. So what does that mean? It means that effectively, when you have fringe benefits, it means that there's been a trade-off between being paid in cash and being paid in benefits. Now, if your salary is high, this is a trade-off, and you're planning on having children and all this, if it is a trade-off you may very well be willing to make. But those we know who don't have paid leave in America don't benefit from. Usually they work in very small firms. They're temporary workers and they're hourly workers. A system that imposed paid leave is effectively a system that tells them, we decide that it's better that you be paid in a mix of benefits and wages as opposed to just wages, right? And so there's always a trade-off for everything. The other thing that people who, and I think this is worth talking about when we talk about paid leave, and the reason why I'm spending a little time on this is because everyone is for a federal paid leave with very rare exceptions, and especially women. And in this battle, it's just like I can think of three of us really actually fighting this fight against the federal paid leave. The reason, this is why I'm spending maybe too much time, feel free to fall asleep. Is that there's another narrative, which is, look, the US is the only industrial country that doesn't have paid leave. And that implies we're missing out on something, right? And the truth is actually there's a huge amount of literature that shows it's actually not the case. This notion that countries that have paid leave programs mandated by the government are fare off better than we do is actually not true. So for instance, when you look at data, let's take Denmark, a program that everyone who wants to pay leave benefits, they look at the dance, like they have these wonderful, like you're a woman, you have a baby, you can be on paid leave for like 52 weeks, I think it is. So 52 weeks, so what, and then they have very gender neutral things. So what the data show is that women are less promoted, they work fewer hours. What is a phenomenon that we see everywhere, but is very pronounced in countries where paid leave is provided by the government or through the government or mandated by the government, is like what happens is before men and women have children, their wages are just growing the same. And then once there are children, there's a gap that forms. There's really a wage that forms where women's wages grow significantly less than men. This is true in the US, Two, this is like, some people call it the motherhood tax, but it's so much less pronounced. The other thing is like, in the US, women tend to work more. There's a lot of evidence that actually the paid leave program, they dissuade women from working more. And it also, this notion of gender neutrality, obviously the National Conservative would not quite care about this, but one of the things that it shows, that other studies have showed, that they actually reinforce gender roles, right? So even in countries that are policy that are just really trying hard to kind of cater to fathers and mothers, they tend to reinforce. Maybe you think that's a good thing, but I'd rather have the choice, right? I'd rather have the choice, and as a woman or the mother of two children, I'd actually would like my children to be promoted to better jobs if they want to. Now, there's also the fact that these programs are very expensive, and the taxes on income tend to really create enormous disincentive, not just to work, but also to innovate, to invest, to do all sorts of things that then drag economic growth, which in and of itself has a lot of consequences. It's worse, actually. I'm going to throw this out there. Denmark has actually a lot of policies, and Denmark, they're not socialist in any way, shape, or form. In fact, in some ways, there's some of the stuff that I would happily adopt, like their very favorable taxation of capital. That's significantly better than ours. But the U.S. average income per capita is in the $70,000. It's significantly less in the U.S. In Denmark, it's like $30,000 less or something like this in Denmark. So it's just like, I mean, maybe it's something you want to do, but I don't. So I think obviously, so that's the first bucket, right? You pay a lot of money to families to kind of put money in their pockets, and with a lot of consequences. The second one is the one that, in my opinion, is even more troublesome, because these type of policies are designed within mind to remove any bias that exists or that they believe exists that would in trying to incentivize women to work. That's how it's phrased right now, right? Is to create a neutrality between working and staying home, which I would have no problem if what it meant was you're just going to remove the barrier. If there are barriers, if there are things that are actually really creating disincentive for women to stay home, then just let's do that. Let's remove these barriers. That's not what they mean. What they mean is like, if you're giving something to women who work, then you should do the same for women who stay at home. So that means that Social Security benefits that you would be getting if you have a kid when you're working, well, you should be getting it too if you're staying at home. I just wonder how fast Social Security would get insolvent if we did this. Probably pretty fast. Senator J.D. Vance, another NatCon populist, however you want to call them, senator, he, like me, he's really upset about the Democrats' big subsidies for childcare. But we're against it for very different reasons. So he thinks, I'll tell you what I think first. I think that first, again, not the role of the federal government. I think it's always worth reminding people. And the other thing is like actually subsidies, in addition to costing a lot of money, they tend to increase the price of things, right? Especially when these subsidies come, as they often do, with a lot of requirements. And they constrain the supply of childcare, and hence making the price of childcare even more expensive, right? Senator Vance's argument is not that at all. His argument is like, it's unfair. If you're giving money to parents who work, or if you're subsidizing childcare, you should also pay parents who stay at home with their kids. And I saw him at a hearing where he said, I was raised by my grandmother. She should be getting money. She should have gotten money. So So the idea here is, right, whatever you give to one, you give to the other, which is all well and fine, but like that kind of like overlooks the fact that we have a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. We have a deficit of $1.6 trillion heading to $2 trillion in a few years. And we're heading our debt to GDP ratio under very rosy scenarios is heading to 166% of GDP. And we have like not any clue about how we're going to be dealing with this, right? So that's the kind of things. But what bothers me the most about this argument is that policy has gone too far in encouraging women to work. And I think the reason why this really bothers me at a fundamental level, and I hope it bothers you too, is like it utterly minimizes the role that women have played in the economy. I mean, as I said, there's just like remarkable evidence of what women entering in the labor force has done to economic growth. That's not nothing. It's like remarkable. Not to mention that it's a little disheartening to see the ease with which the NatCons seems to actually would be happy to dismiss what women entering the labor force has done to unlocking talent, ideas, energy. It's just half of the human race after all, right? I mean, they just seem to be like, let's just not forget, like just let's not care about it. So at the heart of the NatCon position is their belief that, and they say this all the time, historically women used to stay at home while men worked, and that living expenses were so low that a family of 4 could easily live on one income, the dad, of course, while mom joyfully cleaned house and nursed the babies. But the reality is actually not quite right. Claudia Golden, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics this year in 2024, she's actually done a lot of research on this. And historically, sure, if you look at historically and it means 1950 and 1960, sure, maybe you can get away. Actually, you can't really get away with this argument. But historically, what the shape of the labor force participation for women is actually a U, right? Women have actually worked their butt off their whole historical time. Historically, they've worked. And then during the Industrial Revolution, the increase in wages has actually allowed women to work less and has allowed the appearance of a separation between the work life and the home life. But this was new. And by the way, it was only new, but not for everyone, right? This notion that there was ever a time in history where all women were at home. No, not true. No, not true. So I think it's really important to remember this. Okay, so now you'll say, what about? I mean, the income parent trap, the two income trap, right? I mean, are you denying that it's just so much more expensive to raise a family on one income than it was back in the day, right? And again, back in the day for the NatCons mean the 50s and 60s. Even though actually the study that I'm going to talk about that's done by Oren Cass, he actually looked at a family of 4 and purchasing power in 85, right? So that's the idea. So first, it's worth noting that there's MIT a few years ago did something that I thought was really interesting, because they try to assess how much you would need to work to actually get the standard of living of people in 55, in 65, in 75, in 85. The one number that I remember on top of my head is like, if you wanted to have the standard of living of a family in 75, you would have to work 23 weeks. 23 weeks. So what it means effectively is like, if you wanted to work like this, you'd just work 23 weeks and you'd be exactly the same. Now, what would that mean concretely? Well, it means that you'd have to kind of give up all the stuff that you love. Forget Netflix, forget having everyone has a phone in their pockets, forget like after school program, forget vacation, not even in Europe, just like flying to see grandparents several times a year or things like this. This was not the kind of life that people had on average. But you can still have a life on one income if you decide to work and work much less. And in fact, a lot of families still do this. Like there's this kind of notion that somehow right now, though we are a dual income family, dual income family country, it's only 53%. 34% of families live on one income. It's not negligible, right? So that's one thing. There's further evidence that actually the cost of living, you could very well be living, like back in the day. So University of Arkansas, Jeremy Horpendahl, a former GMU grad, was he with you? Was he? Oh, he's younger. He really doesn't look it. And the American Enterprise Institute, Scott Winship, have a study responding to ORNCAS that's saying that, that it's just not possible anymore to raise a family on one income because things have become so expensive. And what they show is that it's emphatically not more difficult for a sole breadwinner to afford essential goods such as food, housing, healthcare, transportation, higher education in 2022 than it was in 1985. And again, I want to remind you that there are a lot of people who do it, like 34% of households do it on a one income. But of course, I guess that can't want it all. Like they want to live like in 75, but they would like, the phone and all of this. That said, that's not what Winship and Horpendahl look at. They actually take the challenge seriously and they say on all of these items, right, is it more expensive? There's another really interesting study, and I can actually send links to Anne, by another scholar at AEI, Angela Rashidi. She looks at whether the decline in marriage, fertility, and the increase in out-of-wedlock childbirths are the result of economic hardship. And she finds that contrary to the prevailing narrative, household and family level income has grown in recent decades after accounting for taxes and transfer. She writes, and this is interesting, and it is counterintuitive. I remember when I read this, I was just like, oh, that's interesting. I did not. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the cost of raising a family, including housing, childcare, and higher education costs, have not grown so substantially over the past several decades that they indicate an affordability crisis, right? So all of these arguments that are used, that somehow, or that like this, they're part of the two-income trap, right? That things are so much more expensive that they can't be afforded, just doesn't actually show in the data. But there's actually, I would say, another argument that actually kind of irks me a little bit more about all of this. And that is that if you think about the argument, which is that when women enter the labor force, they created this bidding war. So they have cash in their pockets now. Those ladies are going shopping, right? And they're bidding out for middle class amenities. Come on, how many of you take economics here? Okay. So, hello, demand goes up. What's missing? Supply? Yeah, supply. The notion, right, that they're entering all this demand, but supply doesn't adjust. It's like nonsense. It's just like, it's utter kind of ignorance of economics, or just actually thinking, maybe, right? Right? But what could actually create supply to not adjust? Any idea? What? No, I mean, actually, it's really simple. Like, think about it. Yeah? Yeah, government interference, right? Good job. I mean, so that's another thing that really pisses me off, which is like these guys, I mean, the Democrats are the same, but, you know, these guys, right? They're demanding pretty radical. I mean, they want to kind of add a lot of taxes in your guys' future with all of these programs in the name of the fact that, and so they want to create government programs in the name of the fact that everything is so much more expensive, right? Because women have entered the labor force, when actually it is the government that tends to restrict supply. So if you look at childcare, for instance, I mean, childcare, absolutely, the increase in demand for childcare when women have entered the labor force, I mean, is real. But if supply adjusts, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is the government is actually, in the states that have, there are studies that show that states that require a lot of things like occupational licensing for safety, like education requirement, and all of these things, they drive up the cost of prices. So, or like permit requirements and things like this, right? So the same for housing, obviously, and healthcare and education. By the way, that's one of the things that I find actually quite remarkable about the study that Winship and Horpendahl were looking at, is that these are actually the areas where the government is the most active. And yes, like it's higher education too. Like, yeah, the government subsidizes the demand like crazy and then restrict the supply. And they're surprised that things are actually much more expensive than it should be. So I have very little patience in general for people who want more government, but I have even less patience actually for people who want more government to address the problem created by the government. And a lot of this is what we're talking about here. There's another thing that I get a little annoyed about. I'll tell you. I'm concerned about the national debt, which is a symptom of overspending and about the lack of backbone of Republicans and Democrats. We have inflation that is partially driven by the fiscal side. The fact that the Federal Reserve, in spite of having raised interest rates quite significantly in the last 40 years, inflation is not just like stuck, but it's actually ticking back up. One of the reasons is because the bozos, I don't know where they are, but where is Congress? Back there, or back there, or back there, or back there. I have no sense of orientation, so, just spend money constantly, right? They're throwing, so like right now it's the Democrats, but I just don't buy that when Republicans are in power, it's going to make much of a difference. We have a big problem, and it just really, I find it like almost offensive now when people are talking about creating new programs without ever even talking about what they would offset in exchange, right? I'd rather never see the program exist, but at the very least have the decency, considering the fiscal situation we have, that if you propose something new, you want more spending for something that exists, or you want a whole new program, just at least propose offsets. And that leads me to, I think, my final point, which is it is very fashionable on the right now to mock free markets focus on economic growth, on the size of the pie. They say, like, there are things that are so much more important. That there are a lot of things that are very important and that I care about. But as a whole, if there is one policy that is probably the most important policy to lift people out of poverty, to create tolerance and that includes religious tolerance, all sorts of good stuff and values, like liberal values, to take us away from tribalism, it's economic growth. I recommend a book that is criminally underrated. It was written by Benjamin Friedman called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. He's a professor at Harvard, and I think it should be, I don't like mandates, but it should be mandatory. So now, NatCons aren't afraid of actually saying, I think it's like kind of like one of the things that really bothers me. You may think, okay, it's just policy, there's bad policy, we see a lot of bad policy and all this, but the thing that actually really bothers me is like, these guys are obsessed with the idea of a one-income family and the return to the 50s and 60s, right? They think it was a better world. Well, not if you're gay, not if you're Black, not if you're all sorts of things. It's not, right? What? No, I mean, there are a lot of minorities that were not better off than they are right now. That's for sure. Is that me doing this? I guess so. Do you think? You think? Well. Anyway, so I have really little problems with their notion that it is. And they're trying to be really respectable by kind of saying that, you know, the world they want is a world where we go back to traditional family values, and that means one income family. But there are others who are actually saying things like, you know, working women are medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome. Maybe I am, for sure. But and it would be better wives, mother, and women generally if they stopped working their jobs. Another worker, a working woman herself, penned, "It goes against our God-given human nature to release children into the hands of the government." I agree with that. Or leave them with outside caregivers for an excessive number of hours. And so imagine kind of if they say this in public, I mean, what they say in private. And I worry because I actually see this trend. And because we have less economic growth, we have more tribalism. And I really worry that what this is really about is not that men are worse off. As a group, they really aren't worse off. But they are worse off relatively to women. That is a fact, right? And I worry that when you don't have enough economic growth, the solution is not to figure out how to lift up the men, but it's going to be how to put down the women. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Questions? Come on. Good.
Does this thing work? Is it working? Everyone hears me loud and clear? All right, I'll wait for some. You guys too? No, first of all, this is too low. First of all, thank you lots for your time and for your speech. I thought it was interesting. I have a few questions though, because first of all, I don't want to strawman you, so let me just get clear what your point was. I think you're against government programs that are mandatory paid leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that is because you think that might increase the amount of people in the workforce, thus drive up demand.
No, that's not my argument. That's the NatCon's argument.
And then your argument would be?
I actually think more people in the workforce is better. There's just a lot of evidence that actually the larger the workforce, the more it brings economic growth. And I have there's a lot of evidence about the greatness of growth. Right. Not just for wealth.
So more people in the workforce inhibits economic growth. Is that
yes.
it?
But again, I don't I want policies that are neutral, that lets people decide, including families, what they want.
Right,
I don't
so-
want to tell people you should work or you shouldn't work. I want policies that are neutral in that regard.
All right. Okay. Thank you for clarifying your point. Here's my question. The thing is, I just looked up the statistics because I was wondering what the statistics were. The USA has one of the worst child mortality rates in the world. USA has one of the worst growth rates in the world. USA has also one of the worst childcare policies in the world, right? Doesn't have paid federal leave, has a lot of things that are not actually conducive to having children, such as, great gun violence in schools, very high education prices, no paid mandatory leave. There's a lot of things that are discouraging people from having children and thus also discouraging people from stimulating economic growth. What are the kind of neutral policies that you'd like to see that offset all these problems while at the same time not hurting the wallets of the American citizen?
So we don't have a paid leave policy mandated by the government, but as I explained, that doesn't mean that companies do not offer paid leave. In fact, I'm going to repeat that number, 66% of workers report to have paid leave policy in the US. The other thing is, and your point about, I will question that we have terrible childcare policy, that we have worse growth than other countries, that I don't think that's actually borne by facts. But let me just address your question of fertility. The trend in the decline in fertility is everywhere, and that includes in countries that have mandated paid leave, and including in countries where paid leave is paid for by the government. These pro-family policies not only are not managing to stop the decline, this is actually a global decline, and these policies have not done anything to actually stop the decline, but also other policies like massive government subsidies specifically targeting the decline in fertility has not been working, except as a way to just basically displace the timing of having children, and then the decline continues. So I just don't see why we should put in place policies that certainly we could have a debate if we knew that there were proven policies that would actually do all these things, or that people would want to do all these things, even if it has a negative impact, even if it costs them a lot of money, even if it adds to the debt. But I just really don't see the point of actually putting in place policies that are not going to do any of this.
So just quick. All right, cool.
Bonsoir, Professeur de Rugy, et merci. Thank you for your time. I think you had a really interesting speech, and you went through things you explained things very clearly. And my question is sort of related to that. Regardless of whether or not people agree on these points, it just seems like in political discourse today, we don't hear enough of your viewpoint. It seems like it's being dominated by the... It seems like it's being dominated by the fringes, the natcons, and people who are further to the left. And this isn't exactly the only time we've seen this sort of trend where basic economic logic is sort of being displaced by more emotional arguments. So do you have any ideas about, I guess, how we can communicate this sort of thing to more people, at least to have a more rich discourse about these sorts of issues and think through things a little more rationally?
Well, I think it's a great question, and if you ever come up with the answer, you should tell me, because we have all been trying. I think something like this is important, right? At least, even if people disagree with what I said, you at least are exposed to arguments that usually you're not going to hear, and so I think this works. Education works. I think, for instance, repeating things, that the fact that the government doesn't provide a particular service doesn't mean this service is not provided at all, is just, it's important. It's because that's where people go. Or that the fact that we want something and they immediately think the government is the better actor, basically, to deliver the service. So there's just a lot of things that we have to really continue educating people on. But there is really actually a trend that is worrisome, especially because what you see on the right is now a growing alliance with actually a lot of the policies from the left, right? And while there used to be a healthy balance between the left and the right, that seems to actually be at least evaporating some. So I think it's important to continue fighting.
Thank you so much. Well spoken as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You covered a lot of topics and you presented the counter arguments pretty well as well, I feel. And part of it, you referred to a paper saying that paid time off in Denmark did not have much of an improvement compared to the USA. I was wondering what measure that was, because I've read papers on how paid time off increases psychological motivation and therefore productivity. So were you referring to like labor participation,
No,
or
so-
what's the measure there?
So as I said, like there's no doubt. So the problem, again, that's an argument that's a problem that we have, right? People think that when you say, I'm against federal paid leave or government paid leave, whether it's mandated or paid for, it means that I think paid leave is not a good thing. In the same way as I would like to see the government out of education. I think education is great. I think education is extremely important, right? So the value of paid leave has been proven left and right. Does it mean that hence the government should mandate it, or does it mean that it should pay for it? My answer is no. There's a philosophical reason for it. There's a principal reason, but there's also a lot of evidence that when it is the government that imposes it, that benefits come with actually a lot of distortions that are not all that beneficiary for the people, the recipient of the program. So you can say that it's worth it, right? But the problem is a one-size-fits-all is always problematic. The system that we have in the US is actually remarkable because of its diversity. And that's only because it's actually provided by the private sector. Does it mean everyone gets it? No, it doesn't. But there's a reason why those who don't get it, don't get it, right? It's like usually there's a good economic reason on the part of those who decide that it's probably better to just pay their employees, or even actually some employees, if were given the choice between having a mix of benefit and pay or just pay, would prefer the pay, right? So there are always trade-offs. And the problem with government programs is that they just impose a lot of cost, and everyone only talks about the benefits.
I see. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Javi. Nice to meet you. So I agree with like a lot of the points that you said, especially what you talked about the national debt. I think it's like basically like a ticking time bomb in this country. I'm also from Florida, so Governor DeSantis is always like I guess bragging about the budget surplus that he created and all those wonderful things. So I'm asking, well, for your like professional opinion, is there something that like the states can do to somehow maybe not alleviate but somehow help in at least decreasing the national debt? Is there something that the government can learn from state governments?
Yes, but I can tell you, they won't do it. They could, for instance, start refusing federal grant money in their state budget. It's like there's a lot of grants coming from the federal government that are filling the coffers of states, and they're just drunk on this, right? Medicaid payments, Medicaid subsidies, which were created under Obamacare, is an example of this. But there are thousands different grant programs. If states said no, right, it would create better. First, we would spend much less money for sure, but it we'd be closer to restore a true federal system. I mean, there's still a lot to do because then you have to do the same with regulations, but it would be a really good first step. Refusing federal education money would be awesome, right? So there's a lot of things, but states don't want to do it. I mean, the same the same incentive problems that plague the federal government exist at the state and local level, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your speech. My question would also be about public debt and your thoughts about the argument that if economic growth exceeds the interest rate of public debt, that should mean that public debt is financeable in the future. And since sovereign states never default on debt, they just print more money and have more inflation. Do you think that this argument holds in the first place? And if no, why not? And why do you think that public debt is a crucial problem and cannot be interpreted in this Keynesian sense?
So it's a great question. So the argument that the question is about a famous speech and then followed by a paper and a book given by Olivier Blanchard, who was the former president of the IMF, in front of the American Economic Association, which said that we don't have to worry about the national debt as long as interest rates are lower than the growth of rate, right? And everyone's like, awesome. We were like in a period where we had like 15 years of really low interest rates. People were sure that this 15 years exception in the entire history of the country was going to be there forever. They were like great excuse to start spending even more. The thing though, is like on paper, it's true. But what Blanchard was saying was actually not applicable to the US at all. What Blanchard was saying is like, and you think about it in your head, if you raise the debt one time, there's one time increase in the debt, right? You borrow money. And then in the years after that, all that you do is borrow money for the interest payment, but you have primary surpluses. So it's basically tax minus spending excluding interest is in surplus forever, right? In this case, if R is smaller than G, yeah, you basically reduce your debt to GDP ratio over time. The US has a 5% primary deficit as far as the eyes can see. Our debt's going like this. Each time there's an emergency, there's an increase in the debt to GDP of 20%. We're not at all in this scenario. And you know what? Those interest rates that were never, ever, ever going to go up, they're up. They literally have been multiplied by like 400% in the last two years. I mean, so that's the problem, right? Even if interest rate hadn't gone up, when you have a debt of 100% of GDP, and then it's going, it means that there's just a lot of, even a small interest rate means a lot of interest payments on the debt. Now, multiply that by the increase in interest rate and the fact that 30% of our debt has a maturity of less than a year. Some of it is 2 weeks, some of it is a month, some of it is 3 months, right? What does this mean? It means that actually very quickly when you have even a small amount in the increase in interest rates, you are faced with enormous amount of interest payments. And this is what we're facing. Right now, interest payments have become the largest budget item that we have. And if it continues, it could become out of control. There's another problem, especially when you raise interest rates to fight inflation, right? I won't bore you about like the connection between the fiscal and the monetary side, but I will say I will say one thing. If your inflation is fiscal, if part of the reason why you have inflation is that you've had excess government spending that investors worry is not going to be repaid, and hence the inflation goes to basically erode the debt to like balance the liability and the assets. What happens when interest payments go up as much and the fiscal side doesn't actually do any adjustments? Well, the government has to borrow, and that puts more fuel on the inflation fire, right? But there is also a lot of reason why I'm against, independently of all this, I want to see our fiscal path to be very different than the one. Well, the first one obviously is like actually like small government, and this is not small government where we have, and it's going to be even not smaller government going forward, right? But there's an enormous literature that actually shows that debt itself actually drags growth. Like there's a moment where debt is so big that actually the debt itself creates a drag on the economy, right? And so also all debt is in theory going to be future taxes, right? If that's what you want, right? Like people who pretend that you can stay forever in a system where you borrow and borrow and borrow, and that it never translates in future taxes is nonsense. And I know that the Americans have lived with this dream that they can have a European government size type spending with American taxes. This is not going to last. So there's just a lot of reasons why I'm against the government debt, and not to mention that so much of what they spend on is just not just waste. It's just it's cronyism. Look at the CHIP Acts. Look at the Inflation Reduction Act. These are all subsidies to enormous companies to do things that they were already doing. I'm against that. I'm absolutely against that.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Josiah. I want to thank you again for coming to speak to us tonight. I really like what you had to say about federal paid leave. I've never really heard arguments against it before, but I thought they were really well articulated. Yeah. I thought they were really well articulated and really thought-provoking, so thank you for that. I was wanting to talk to you a little bit about child tax credits. I think you might have briefly mentioned it.
I'm against it.
Yeah, from what I've heard about it, at least my opinion is I feel like it has the advantage of reducing taxes to a specific sect of American people that could really use the break. As a libertarian, I'm assuming you're in favor of less taxes. And then along with that, it can also help slightly solve the fertility problem in that it increases the advantage of having kids in countries where fertility is going down.
So unfortunately, it really doesn't. I mean, I don't know that there's actually been enormous experiment about child tax credit, but like you look at countries like Hungary who've spent and Taiwan spent, and South Korea, spent like enormous amount of program like on trying to raise fertility. The only impact it has is to basically displace the time of birth. It doesn't. So at the beginning, you have a little increase in fertility, but that's only because people want to take advantage of the money and just say, you know what, we were going to have kids in 2 years, let's have it now, right? It just doesn't work. And it may work at a scale that would be bankrupting any country, right? So that doesn't work. The child tax credit, I have many objections against tax credits in general. Actually, I think it's a very bad way to do social spending or to do spending in general. I think it's not transparent. I think it's moving us away from actually having an efficient tax code, which has a broad base and preferably lower rates. But I will tell you an argument that convinces no one, but I really believe in, is just I think ultimately it's really unfair that people making the same amount of money pay different amount of taxes, either because they buy a house, so they have mortgage interest deduction, or they have children, or they have, and so people say, well, the children is different and all this, but fine. I mean, okay, have a small child tax credit, right? A small one. But right now what they're talking about is just basically a transfer of wealth that is enormous, away from people who don't have children towards people who have children. And I mean, I know it's just like I'm definitely not a very this is not a very popular position. But let me make one more argument. No welfare program, should ever be looked at independently of other programs. And the child tax credit sits on top of the earned income tax credit, food stamps, and many, many, many other programs. When you look only at food stamps and the SNAP, and this I think is called the supplemental nutritional something, blah, blah, SNAP, food stamp. And then you look at the child tax credit and the expansion that they want to do, you realize the enormous disincentive to work that it creates for lower income parents. And I think, by the way, the proposal that they want, it benefits rich people too. I mean, it's like, I can't remember when it starts phasing in, but there are people who make hundreds of thousands of dollars who would get it. I just think that's just wrong, right? So when you look at the marginal, so our welfare program right now has built in some incentives to work. They're small, but they exist, and I think it's very good, right? But they're small. If you raise even more the child tax credit, you really create much more disincentive to work for single parents in particular, because the cliff would be really quite large when you start losing those benefits. And these are precisely the parents who actually could really benefit from the income mobility. And there's no better way to get children out of poverty than income mobility. We've seen this with the welfare tax reform in the 90s.
Thank you for your insight.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. My name is Francisca, and I have two questions. I'm just gonna say it really quickly. First of all, I was very shocked when you mentioned how the conservatives were pushing for increased subsidy programs or welfare programs, because that felt very unconservative of the conservatives. But I found it also interesting because I feel like we're trying to address an issue that it seems more cultural and ideological with policy and with money, which seems to be kind of like a consistent American problem. But one question that I do have is that why is it that we have these policymakers in DC and wherever who are supposed to be very educated and surrounded by lots of advisors, why do they make these poor decisions with finances and the economy, which is what they're technically handling? Why do they keep proposing ideas like subsidies and programs, borrowing money that we don't have when they should know better? And the second question that I do have is that can economics solve everything? The issue of choice in terms of, we want women to work if they want to work, and we want them to stay at home if they want to stay at home. Because I'm an education minor and psychology major, and I honestly, everything you talked about, I literally just studied it the spring term. And it is very important for the children and the mother to that 1 year off after they give birth. It is super important. And like the quote that you mentioned, I don't know if it was against the NatCon people, but about how it's not good for women to leave their babies to just some stranger, for such extended periods of time. It is very true that, and it's also,
well, let me take on, so paid leave again is a good thing. It comes with a real cost, right? If you're a woman and you're absent from the workforce for a whole year, there's going to be a lot of impact to your career. And a lot of women may be willing to do this. In fact, there are women who leave the workforce when they have young children and come back later, right? But I think we shouldn't kind of expect that there is no cost.
What I was going for is choice. We let this be up to the people and not,
we should leave it to the people. And so I wanna commend you for actually pointing out something that most people don't understand, right? You don't solve cultural issues with government money, right? And that's one of the things that bothers me the most in a lot of these debates, is that you see that people don't want to do the hard work, that is to persuade people. If you think that people need to get married, if you think people need to have more children, if you think that men should, get back to work, just try to persuade people. Don't try to actually make up policies that are going to be poorly targeted and not achieve their goal. And I'm so old that I've already forgotten your first question. So
no, it's just, can econ solve? Can econ allow women to
good
make
policies.
Those choices themselves?
For the most part, get the government out of the way. The government is creating a ton of subsidy of the demand for a lot of restriction of the supply, and that's why there are a lot of things that are actually quite expensive. But also stop saying that America is in decline. actually there are people who are left behind, and we should care about those people, and we should actually target policies for these people. But overall, we need to understand that actually the country has done remarkably well. Even when you look at the counties that lost all these manufacturing jobs, 62% of these counties have actually reinvented themselves quadratically, and 22% are actually now starting a renaissance. And then there are counties that are just not faring as well. But it's just like, if you want to just kind of basically take everything that goes wrong and claim that this applies to the whole country, you're not going to have the right type of policies. Okay. Oh. Well, you can ask me at home. Hi, go ahead.
One more? Or
Yeah.
were you telling us we were
Last
done?
question.
This is last? Okay.
You guys can email me.
So I just want to thank you for coming. My name is Ephraim. You were talking about how government shouldn't be in charge of education. You made a comment about it, but then when you got on to putting your children somewhere else other than with the parents, you didn't make a comment on it. So I was just inferring that you are still for parents putting their children in some place of education. And I just wanted to ask, say in an ideal situation where government wasn't in charge of the majority of education and parents could put kids where they want that fit with their family values, at what point do you think the parents are, like in your ideal world, would that mean all the parents are working and they're not home, no one's staying at home? Or would it be at what point does it become too many parents are at home and we are neglecting our responsibility to our own kids?
Well, so yes, I believe education is a really good thing. And again, the fact that I would prefer the government not to be involved doesn't mean that I don't highly value education. In fact, I actually think that with less government involvement in education, would have better education.
100% agree.
So I believe in school choice. You know, at the second, as a second best to not having government involved in education. But I think it will ultimately, even if we had all these different options for parents, right? I think it will. The choices that parents will make will depend. They will depend on. Women. There are a lot of women who want to stay at home with their kids, and that's totally fine. That is absolutely fine. But I will say, right, that another thing that bothers me about the whole discussion about the one income household and how the two income household is a trap is precisely that it implies that in a way women have not sought to increase the labor to get involved. No, I'm not saying you're doing this.
I just wanted to clarify too. I'm also all for like the idea of men also having the option to stay home as well. It's not, to me, it's not a gender issue.
Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. No, I agree. And in fact, it's probably the way that the problem is going to be solved is like maybe more men are gonna stay home, and all the power to them.
I guess I just want to like make sure I get the root of my question. The root of my question is really coming from, if we are pushing for as many people to be in the workforce as possible and creating that stigma, are we pushing people away from their own kids?
Well, so the idea is never to encourage, people to adopt a particular lifestyle. Right? There's a difference between saying more people involved in the labor force is a better thing, and it's a whole other thing that it doesn't mean that we should then push policy that push everyone in the labor force, right? And so I just like I believe that people should actually decide what they want to do. I think there should be no barriers, no government barriers that either push them to work or actually encourage them or create massive disincentive not to work. Unfortunately, we haven't talked about all these men who have dropped out of the labor force, but one of the reasons is precisely that there are so many barriers or incentive to actually stay unemployed. I'm not saying that there would be no men dropping out of the labor force. That's not what I say. There are always, but they would be fewer, right? It was like housing, like moving to another place where there are better jobs. That's been the American way. It's actually made very, very difficult now because of housing regulation. That means that the premium of higher wages or even seeking a job somewhere is actually eaten up entirely by the rent you pay. And because you can actually stay unemployed in a state, you know, those men who've dropped out of the labor force, if you exclude a vast majority of them, have dropped out since the 90s, they're on disability insurance. Some of these people are disabled for sure, but a lot of them, they could work, right? But if you can't move and get another job somewhere else, you might as well stay where you are. And that's a trend that we're seeing for a lot of these men. They're staying in areas where wages are low, unemployment is high, but rent is low, right? And that is a government, and in part is a government created. It's a government created problem. There's a lot of other things. Occupational licensing, the requirement for licensing makes them very hard to move from another state, right? And very costly to then get retrained in another state. That's the problem. There are states like Arizona who've created reciprocal recognition, and good for these states, but we don't have enough of this. So there's just all sorts of disincentive to work that exist, and government barriers that are keeping people not working. And I think it's an enormous problem.
Thank you so much for clarifying.
Thanks. You're welcome.
Thank you.